For more than 3,000 years, the story of the Trojan War has stood at the crossroads of history and legend. It is a tale of heroes and gods, of love and betrayal, of courage and destruction. Yet behind the poetry and myth lies a question that still fascinates historians. Did the war for Troy really happen? Or was it simply the greatest story ever told? The idea of 1,000 ships sailing across the Aegean to rescue a stolen queen has shaped Western imagination for centuries. But beneath the surface of myth may lie a memory of something real, a war fought not by gods, but by men. In a time when civilizations were collapsing and new worlds were being born, the Trojan War is one of the foundational stories of Western civilization. Its most famous version comes from Homer's Iliad, composed sometime around the 8th century BCE. The poem does not tell the entire war but focuses on a few weeks in its final year: the quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon, the death of Hector, and the fate of Troy. For ancient Greeks, the Trojan War was not merely a legend, it was a shared memory, a defining event that shaped their understanding of honor, fate, and heroism. They believed their ancestors had fought and died on the plains of Troy, and that the ruins of that city still stood as proof. Modern readers see the story differently. We see it through layers of time, myth turned into literature, and literature blended with archaeology. Over the centuries, the question has remained: how much of Homer's war reflects a real conflict? The search for answers has taken historians, poets, and archaeologists deep into the past, to the late Bronze Age, around the 12th or 13th century BCE, when powerful kingdoms ruled both Greece and Anatolia. It was an age of palaces, trade routes, and chariots, but also of fragile alliances and frequent wars. Somewhere in that turbulent world, the seed of the Trojan legend may have taken root. To understand the Trojan War, we first need to understand the world that produced it. In the centuries before Homer, the Greek mainland was dominated by the Mycenaean civilization. Their kings ruled fortified citadels like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. They spoke an early form of Greek, worshipped gods familiar to Homer's audience, and sent traders and warriors across the Aegean. Their world was connected by sea routes that reached as far as Egypt and the Near East. Across the Aegean lay Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where the Hittite Empire ruled much of the land. On its western edge stood the kingdom of Wilusa, known from Hittite records, a name that many scholars believe refers to Ilios, or Troy. This city occupied a strategic position at the entrance to the Dardanelles, a narrow passage controlling trade between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Whoever held Troy controlled the flow of goods, metals, and wealth. According to Greek tradition, Troy was ruled by King Priam and his sons, including the noble Hector and the reckless Paris. The story begins when Paris visits Sparta and abducts Helen, wife of King Menelaus, taking her back to Troy. Enraged, Menelaus calls upon his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and together they unite the Greek kingdoms in a coalition to bring her home. This is the spark that ignites the war. Though to ancient audiences, the abduction of Helen was more than personal revenge. It symbolized the struggle between order and chaos, between loyalty and pride. To modern scholars, it may hint at real tensions between the Mycenaean Greeks and the Anatolian states over trade, power, and territory. For centuries, many believed the story of Troy was pure fiction. That changed in the 19th century when Heinrich Schliemann, a German archaeologist driven by Homer's poetry, began excavating a hill called Hizarlik in northwestern Turkey. Beneath the soil, he uncovered the remains of multiple ancient cities built one atop another. Among them was a wealthy and fortified settlement that had been destroyed by fire around 1200 BCE, the same period traditionally assigned to the Trojan War. Schliemann's discoveries transformed the debate. It no longer seemed impossible that Homer's story had been inspired by a real war, a conflict remembered and reshaped through generations of storytelling. The Greek fleet gathered at Aulis, a port in Boeotia. Legends speak of 1,000 ships, carrying warriors from every corner of Greece. The kings of this coalition represented the finest of the age. Agamemnon, commander of all the forces, proud and ruthless. Menelaus, fighting to reclaim his wife. Odysseus, the cunning strategist from Ithaca. Ajax the Great, a towering warrior unmatched in brute strength. Diomedes, brave and capable, second only to Achilles. And Achilles himself, the mightiest of all, a demigod born of the sea nymph Thetis and the mortal Peleus. Even before reaching Troy, the campaign was marked by tension. At Aulis, the winds refused to blow, a punishment from the goddess Artemis. To appease her, Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter, Iphigenia, an act that sowed resentment among his men and set a tone of divine unrest. When the Greeks finally landed on the Trojan shore, they expected a quick victory. Instead, they faced a city built to endure. Troy's massive walls and strategic position made it nearly impossible to capture by direct assault. The war dragged on for 10 years. In those years, the Greeks besieged, raided, and fought endless skirmishes across the plains of Troy. The Trojans, led by Hector and aided by their allies from Anatolia and Thrace, resisted fiercely. The war was as much about pride as conquest. Achilles, the Greeks' greatest weapon, withdrew from battle after a quarrel with Agamemnon. The commander had seized Achilles' prize, the captive woman Briseis, insulting his honor. Achilles' withdrawal turned the tide. The Trojans gained ground, pressing the Greeks back toward their ships. Hector, noble and brave, became the defender of Troy. He was both warrior and family man, torn between duty to his people and love for his wife, Andromache, and their infant son. His humanity gave the war its moral weight. In Achilles' absence, the Greeks suffered devastating losses. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, begged to rejoin the fight. Donning Achilles' armor, he rallied the Greeks but was slain by Hector. This single act unleashed a storm. Blinded by grief and fury, Achilles returned to battle. His wrath was terrible. He cut through Trojan ranks like a force of nature, slaughtering warriors and defying the gods themselves. When he finally met Hector, the two faced each other before the gates of Troy. Their duel ended with Hector's death and Achilles' descent into vengeance. He desecrated Hector's body, dragging it behind his chariot. The act horrified even the gods. Later, King Priam came secretly to Achilles' tent to beg for his son's body. In one of the most poignant moments in ancient literature, Achilles relented. Two grieving men, once enemies, shared a moment of understanding. The price of war revealed in silence, but the end was inevitable. The Greeks could not breach Troy's walls through strength, so they turned to deception. Odysseus proposed the Trojan Horse, a massive wooden structure left as a supposed offering to the gods. The Greeks pretended to sail away, leaving the horse at Troy's gates. Inside the horse were elite warriors, hidden and waiting. Despite warnings from the priest Laocoon, who cried, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," and from Cassandra, cursed to speak the truth and never be believed, the Trojans brought the horse into the city as a symbol of victory. That night, while Troy slept, the Greeks emerged. They opened the gates, signaling their army's return under cover of darkness. The city was set ablaze. Priam was killed at his own altar. Hector's infant son was thrown from the walls, and the women of Troy were taken captive. By dawn, the city that had stood for centuries was gone. Archaeological evidence supports the destruction of a wealthy city at Hisarlik around 1200 BCE. The walls show fire damage, and the settlement was never the same again. Whether this was the real Troy or another city that inspired the legend, the echoes align too closely to dismiss. The Iliad ends before the fall, but the legend continued through later epics. The Aethiopis, the Little Iliad, the sack of Troy. They completed the cycle, shaping the story that would define the end of the heroic age. In myth, the fall of Troy marks both an end and a beginning. For the Greeks, it was a victory tainted by loss. Many heroes never returned home. Agamemnon was murdered upon his arrival in Mycenae. Odysseus wandered for 10 years before reaching Ithaca. Achilles had already fallen, killed by an arrow to his heel, the one mortal part of his body. For history, the period around 1200 BCE was one of collapse. Across the eastern Mediterranean, great powers fell in rapid succession. The Mycenaean palaces were burned, the Hittite Empire vanished, and trade networks disintegrated. Scholars call this the Late Bronze Age collapse. The causes remain debated: invasions, drought, earthquakes, or internal revolts. But the result was centuries of darkness and isolation. If the Trojan War was a real event, it may have been one of the last great conflicts of that fading world. The memory of it survived in oral tradition, carried by poets for generations until Homer shaped it into epic poetry centuries later. By then, the war had become larger than life. No longer just a battle between kingdoms, but a story about the human condition: pride, love, fate, and the cost of glory. The ruins of Troy still stand on the windswept hills of Turkey. The stones are silent, but they whisper of fire and ruin, of heroes whose names have outlived their kingdoms. Whether the Trojan War was myth or memory, it remains a mirror of humanity itself. Our longing for greatness, our fear of loss, and our need to find meaning in the past. Perhaps that is why, after more than 3 millennia, we still return to the story of Troy, because in its echoes we hear the timeless struggle between what is real and what we choose to remember.